Hi there, I'm Will Lowen, and thanks for tuning in to the sermon videos here at Trinity Mennonite Church in Calgary, Alberta. For the months of May and June, I'll be doing a sermon series called Government and God's People, a look at how the church today, the early church, even the people of Israel in the Old Testament, how they did and how they should interact with the government forces around them. It will involve looking at some controversial issues of our day, and I know that a lot of us bring a high level of personal and emotional involvement into these subjects, and so take that into consideration as you're watching this. This isn't a lecture series on policing or public policy or immunology or any of that. These are sermons I'm hoping to inform and inspire by looking at God's Word and how we, the church, are supposed to behave. I hope this series is helpful and inspiring for you.
For our scripture reading today, I'll be reading from Mark 14, 1-8, using the New Revised Standard Version. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." While he was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the Leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial." Pastor Will, we look forward to hearing from you this morning.
Great. Thanks, Laura, for that reading. Thanks again to all of you for showing up, for logging in, however you're connecting. Lots of people are watching afterwards, and that's great as well. I wanted to start by giving a bit of an update about some summer programming. So we are anticipating that rules will be loosened sometime this week. And in anticipation of that, we're going to be having bonfires this summer. They're not, I don't expect they will be huge events. They're certainly not mandatory. We're looking forward to reconnecting, and some people are much more comfortable to reconnect outdoors, where the studies have often showed that the risk of transmission is lower. So we're going to be gathering on Friday evenings, and I guess we could say, we haven't set a time, so we'll say 7 o'clock, and there'll still be plenty of light, but that will give everybody time to get home at whatever they determine is reasonable time. We are changing our worship times for the summer. We're going to be gathering at 10. We'll have a time of connecting in person, and then we will start the live stream at 10:30. We'll try that for a little while, and if things need to be changed, we will enjoy the flexibility to make those changes. So I've been going through this series on government and God's people, how the church has been reacting, should be reacting to the disease and the lockdown. I've been telling a lot of Bible stories, some Martyr's Mirror stories. I haven't really given a lot of heavy-handed advice, and so I was talking to some folks who said maybe just some tips on how we can react. So I'm going to just give a little bit of that. I've chatted with a lot of people who have been vaccinated, gotten both of their vaccines already. I've talked to some people who are holding off, but who put a lot of thought into it and have well thought out reasons around it. In terms of who to follow, who to get medical advice from, you should get advice from people who will suffer consequences for giving bad advice. That seems relatively obvious, but your doctor has standards to live by. Your doctor has a system of accountability. Anybody can put videos on YouTube. There's lots of videos of me on YouTube. Sebastian has airplane videos on YouTube. It's very easy to put medical advice videos on YouTube, but they don't all experience consequences of giving bad advice. Give advice or take advice from people who are capable of both agreeing and disagreeing. It's easy to oppose the government. It's easy to celebrate the government. It's much more difficult to live in a sort of a nuanced space in between and say, yes, sometimes this government makes good decisions, sometimes they make bad decisions. When somebody always says the government is doing bad things, it's harder to know if that criticism is rooted in something real, because that's all they know how to do. So find people who understand the nuance of political engagement. We need to understand the difference between anecdotes and evidence. Anecdotes, one thing can happen. Every now and then somebody wins the lottery. The vast majority of people who buy a lottery ticket never see that money again. The anecdote is the person who wins says, yeah, the lottery's a great idea. The evidence is almost everybody else loses money. So every now and then somebody will have a negative reaction to a vaccine. Every now and then somebody's going to get the virus and be perfectly fine right away. But the broader evidence is different than that. And the other thing is, a lot of us get advice from other Christian voices, whether it's locally or from around the world. And Christians can sometimes give advice on a wide variety of things. And when somebody else is a Christian, we know that they speak the same language. In theory, they're motivated by the same things as us. But what we don't always know is if we can sort of test their advice through their experience and knowledge. We don't always know their background understanding, but what we can see is character. And if their character demonstrated in the way that they're giving advice lines up with Jesus's character, then I personally am willing to learn from that person. If it seems inconsistent with Jesus's character, then I'm less willing to follow that. And Jesus's character doesn't mean blindly following the government. We don't see that in Jesus's character. It also doesn't mean getting mad and opposing the government at every turn. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus works within the nuance, and so we have to find that space as well. And hopefully the people that we're getting advice from will do that as well. So with this pandemic, we're seeing a lot of ways that health is interconnected to a whole lot of things. Health is interconnected to the economy. Health is interconnected to public policy. And when health becomes a public thing, then there's enforcement of health things. All of that is interconnected. And health always has been interconnected. If you talk to any kind of doctor, I don't know why I was trying to say doctor and lawyer at the same time. If you talk to any kind of doctor, whether it's the traditional doctor that has a clinic with that you can use your Alberta health card to pay for those services, or it's a non-conventional doctor, if it's ancient medicinal practices, whether you're a chiropractor, all of them will say your health is interconnected. So we'll see that poor people have more health problems. It's not because there's something, they are poor and therefore more likely because of the reasons that they are poor. No, you don't have enough money to have good health care. You don't have enough money to set aside time to get medical treatment that you need. Your health is going to suffer. When people are happier, they are healthier. They have less stress. They're not worried about as many things, and they're not fearful of as many things. Now, there are plenty of people who are happy who die young. There are plenty of people who are poor and are super healthy. There are people who are rich and who are unexpectedly unhealthy. But in general, these things are interconnected. And when somebody gets sick, when you've had a disease, you might feel that interconnectedness. Because when we are sick, it isn't just doctors who will give us advice. Everybody will give us advice. And if, heaven forbid, you get some sort of ailment that's directly connected to lifestyle, if you get lung cancer, there will be some people who are fairly unsympathetic in their response to your disease. There are interconnectedness to various lifestyle choices, and sometimes people who are maybe quick to judge, or who they themselves believe that they are not going to get that ailment because they are smarter and have better lifestyle choices, you will feel their judgment. And we've all felt that before in one way or another, either the giving or the receiving, whether we admit it or not. Our health is interconnected to so many other things within our society. There's the Old Testament story I want to look at today comes from Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, Abraham and Sarah are traveling and they go to Egypt. And when they get there, Abram looks at his wife, and as many husbands do, he realizes how beautiful she is and how desirable she is. And so he says, wait a second, this is going to get me in trouble. We're in a strange land, and the Pharaoh has a lot of power. He can just take anything that he wants, including people. And if he wants to take Sarah, nothing is going to stop him. He's just going to have me arrested or killed, and that'll be the end of my story. So we need to work out a plan. So he says to Sarah, okay, when we get there, we'll tell everybody that you're my sister. And then nobody will kill me, and then we can go back home eventually. Well, what happens is they do this, and then Pharaoh, just like it's predicted, sees how beautiful she is, and then he takes her into his harem, and then gives Abraham a blessing, gives him gifts, gives him animals and servants and so on. And then it says, so this is Genesis chapter 12, verse 17. It says, then the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarah. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, what's this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I made her my wife? Now, here's your wife. Take her and go. So there's a plague. It doesn't go into details, but there's a disease, a sickness that is impacting Pharaoh's household. Now, we could speculate on some of the details that are here. We could try to kind of dig into the historical books to find out what the sickness is, but the storyteller doesn't tell us, but we already know this is all interconnected. Why is she sick, or why is Pharaoh and his household sick? Well, because God has condemned him taking Sarah, and then he gets rid of her. Somehow Pharaoh is aware of this. This is all interconnected. And some of this is just the reality of human life, that health is interconnected. Some of this, I think, is the artistic way that our storytellers bring these stories to us. Everything is connected. Now, we can criticize Abram here for the way that he's acted. We could say, well, Abram, you've gotten a promise of a blessing from God. Why would you put yourself in a position where you're taking care of your own problems instead of letting God do it? Well, why are Abram and Sarah in Egypt in the first place? Because there was a famine. Nobody in the Bible goes to Egypt unless there are problems in Israel. Right? They are in Egypt because there were problems with the weather. Because a shortage of rain, now all of a sudden they're in Egypt. They didn't think that God was protecting them in Israel, so they didn't think God would protect them in Egypt. So all of these details are connected. All of these choices have consequences. We don't always know if we can rely on promises based on the surroundings that we have. Abram didn't know that. Abram and Sarah couldn't trust that. So they had to make decisions on their own, but there were consequences to that. Historically, Mennonites, and not just Mennonites throughout the church, but I know the Mennonite story a little bit better. Historically, Mennonites have been skeptical of government response to disease and sickness. And part of it is because we haven't always understood the science. Early on, there wasn't much science to know. And then afterwards, Mennonites had often been pushed out of established halls of academia, government decision-making groups, and so we were left out. We didn't learn the things that we needed to learn, and we weren't given the information that we needed to be given. And so there's skepticism that comes without a lack of without adequate information being given. And sometimes Mennonites have intentionally removed themselves from those schools of higher learning. They've intentionally ignored the information that was available because they couldn't trust it, because they couldn't trust who it was coming from. Some of that's happening now. It's not new. And in Mennonite communities and in the early church, we have gotten quite used to taking care of each other. So then we don't need to rely on government health care because we had been giving ourselves health care. This is what happened in remote colonies in different parts of the world. This is what happened in communities before organized health care was a thing. And so we didn't really need to pay attention to government mandates about health because we were already doing our own health. There are many stories in the early church of when there was a plague or some sort of disease happened in a community, everybody would leave the community because they didn't know how diseases were communicated from one person to another. They didn't understand the science of that. And so they would leave to avoid the plague, to avoid the demonic forces that they understood were behind the plague. But the Christians stayed. The Christians stayed to care for the sick, and Christians from other communities came to that community to help in caring for the sick. And then eventually the disease would pass one way or another, and the people who survived, they said, wait a second, these people put their lives on the line for us. And the church grew, not because they were entitled to their freedoms to make their own decisions. No, the church grew because the church cared. When the church cares, then there's room for growth. When the church only cares about itself, then decline is inevitable. But also in the past, and I think this is worth noting, sometimes in the history of, especially in the history of Europe, the church has been skeptical of disease prevention because sometimes Anabaptists, Mennonites were understood to be the disease, which sounds a little strange. This time the story I'm going to tell isn't from one of the martyrs' stories, but it is from the Martyr's Mirror. There was an edict, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, an edict by Charles V. Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was in charge of most of Europe, and then as Europe expanded, then he became not just the emperor of the Catholic territories of Europe, he became the emperor also of the Spanish and Portuguese-controlled areas of South America, and the emperor of the French-controlled areas of North America. So Charles V was in charge of a whole bunch of land, made a whole bunch of important decisions. But he made an edict in 1535, and I read part of it before, but I want to read it again as a way of pointing out the interconnectedness of all of these things. So he writes, and again, I think it's also worth noting, Charles V would have written, this is 1535, he would have written in Latin. That Latin was then translated into Dutch for the initial printing of this. And then in 1880s, it was translated into English. So some of the nuanced word meanings maybe aren't exactly what was intended, but from what's in front of me, I think some of those connections are clear. So I'll just read it, and then I'll point out the keywords afterwards. So he writes, "And since it has come to our knowledge that, notwithstanding our aforesaid decrees, many and various sectarians," so that means kind of people within little groups, little sects, S-E-C-T-S, just in case the audio wasn't clear there. Many and various sectarians, even some who call themselves Anabaptists, and it's worth pointing out, Anabaptists didn't call themselves Anabaptists. Anabaptist means re-baptizers, and the Anabaptists said, hey, we've only had one baptism. Our adult baptism is the only one that matters, the only one that counts, the only one that was meaningful to us. So we've only been baptized once. The outsiders, they said, oh, well, they're Anabaptists. And now, all these years later, we say, well, we may as well use that word to describe them and ourselves, but that's not what they were. That's not what they called themselves anyway. Some who call themselves Anabaptists have proceeded and still daily proceed to spread, sow, and secretly preach their aforesaid abuses and errors in order to allure a great number of men and women to their false doctrine and reprobate sect. I should have looked up reprobate ahead of time. That's a fun word. But anyways, he goes on to add the list of their errors. He says, to seduce them and rebaptize some. Now, seduce can mean a lot of things, but of course there's a sexual connotation to this word, right? And just like in the story of Abram and Sarah, there's the sexual connotation of that interaction. Right, so Charles V is saying, hey, there's a religious problem here, but to communicate it, he says he's using sexual terminology, which seems above and beyond. He wouldn't need to make that connection, but that's really one of the first kind of metaphors that he uses here. To seduce them and to rebaptize some to the great reproach and disregard of the sacrament of holy baptism and of our edicts, statutes, and ordinances. Therefore, we, intending to guard against and remedy this, right? Remedy has a variety of uses, but it's very often used as a medical explanation. A remedy is a cure. A remedy is health terminology, right? So religious situation, sexual terminology, medical terminology. Right, intending to guard against and remedy this, summon and command you that immediately upon receipt of this, you cause it to be proclaimed within every place and border of your dominions, that all those or such as shall be found polluted, right? So if you're finding people in your domain who are polluted by this doctrine. Right? We've seen two other metaphors already. Now we have this environmental metaphor. Right? Polluted. This is a spiritual problem, but we've already seen these three metaphors kind of pointing to the interconnectedness. Polluted by the accursed sect of the Anabaptists, of whatever rank or condition they may be, their chief leaders, adherents, and abettors shall incur the loss of life and property and be brought to the most extreme punishment without delay. So this is the kind of writing that made our ancestors become arrested and tortured and killed. So it's a significant historical document to include in the Martyr's Mirror. But it's interesting that the fear of the Anabaptists at that time and since then, and sometimes, is sort of the fear of what we would now understand as communism. That these Christian groups would sometimes, emphasizing Acts chapter 2, the stories of the early church where everybody held everything in common. So then people say, hey, we don't want to become Anabaptists because we don't want our wealth to be redistributed. We don't want our possessions to go to other people. We don't want that imposed on us, so we're going to stop that from happening. Well, what happens? How do they do that? Well, they do that by promising that if you are an Anabaptist, you will be arrested and your wealth will be redistributed. All right? So it's a kind of irony that in order to punish people out of fear of redistribution of wealth, you enact a redistribution of wealth. But that's also sort of the fourth metaphor. Right now there's an economic component to this. Right? At some level, this is a spiritual situation, but it has implications and accusations in all of these other ways, now including economic. The New Testament story that Laura read for us was from Mark chapter 14. And some of you were part of our Bible study series this spring where we looked at stories that happen in more than one gospel. And we compared how the story was told in Matthew, different than Mark, different than Luke, different than John. And one of them that stood out was this one. The story of Jesus' anointing at Bethany is kind of the title that it's given. This is one of the few stories that exists in all four Gospels. And even at the end of it, Jesus says, hey, whenever the gospel is proclaimed anywhere, the story of this woman will be told. Now, this isn't a legalistic thing. If you're summarizing Jesus' message to somebody, you're not law-bound to include this story. But I think all of it does emphasize the centrality of this. But I thought it also did a really good job of pointing out the interconnectedness of all of the things like I mentioned. So in the Mark version of the story, the gospel writer is setting the timeline as that the people are approaching the festival where Jesus would be arrested. But the people didn't want their festival to be ruined. Right? There's already a public policy component here. That there's a spiritual problem, which they also, the Pharisees, believe it to be also a legal problem. But it's still a public policy problem because they don't want everybody to be angry. They know as well that this is an interconnected thing. They can't upset one thing without upsetting other things. Now, this happened in the home of Simon the Leper. And depending on the translation, some will maybe kind of point out this is maybe a past tense thing. It seems if he actively had leprosy, Jesus wouldn't be in his home. Other people wouldn't be in his home because he would have been set aside, cast out of the community. But one way or the other, maybe he had leprosy before, maybe he had a milder version of it now. But this man, even if he's healed and cured of it, he's not in the community. He's not a well-respected person in society because they understood him to be unclean ceremonially. But this is where Jesus is. Jesus is in the home of a person with leprosy. right? Because already Jesus has demonstrated this interconnectedness. That's a big fun word, but he's pointed out in a whole bunch of stories. Laura asked the kids and all of us to think of stories where Jesus healed people. The story rarely ends with Jesus healing somebody. There's a restoration of health. There's also a restoration of standing in the community. There's a restoration of physical abilities. There's often stories of muscles regrowing, ability to stand right away after a leg healing. But there's also restoration of spirituality. When somebody is cured, Jesus often tells them their sins are forgiven. Right? Jesus already has demonstrated to the people health is interconnected to so many other things. Now, there's an economic component to this story too, because the woman comes in with this expensive perfume. We don't know where she's gotten it from, but she pours it on Jesus, wasting it, not being able to use it for anything else later on, not being able to resell it for anything else later on. This is what she's doing. This is what she's decided to do. And depending on the gospel reading that you get, there are people in the room who are upset. Some say it's the disciples, some say it's the Pharisees, but they are upset about this waste of money. And we sometimes forget about this in Canada because our healthcare system protects us from this, but health issues are often interconnected to financial issues. Our friends south of the border see more bankruptcies connected to healthcare than from regular business. So this is a problem with their system, not that ours doesn't have problems, but there's an interconnectedness there. So then Jesus, in his response, in his rebuke to the disciples, to the other people, points out to them, she's doing this for my burial. All right? This isn't just a gift. This isn't just an emotional woman doing unpredictable things. She's doing a spiritually significant act. Right? There's an interconnectedness there too. The Luke version of the story adds a whole bunch of stuff about forgiveness that we don't see in Mark. Right? He adds in a parable of the debtors and asks the Pharisees around him, who do you think loves more in the parable of the debtors? Who loves more? Well, the obvious answer is, well, the one who had the most forgiven. And we hope that the Pharisees, in their distrust of Jesus, realized, wait a second, maybe I haven't asked for forgiveness. Maybe that's why I'm not as crazy about this guy. This woman has had a lot forgiven. Depending on, and some Gospels mention it more than others. Matthew and Mark mention this is a sinful woman. And then her presence would be unwelcome for that reason too. So she's there, she's demonstrating to Jesus how much she appreciates all that she has been forgiven. In the Matthew telling, this is Mary, Lazarus' sister Mary, who's doing this. And then after the story, the leaders say, maybe we should add Lazarus to this list of people that need to be killed. In this story, it's not directly about health, but we see the health implications with Lazarus because that's his identity. He was raised from the dead. We see the health connections with Simon the Leper, but all of this is connected. Everybody needs restoration in this story, but not everybody acknowledges that. Simon the Leper knows it. That's why he's hosting Jesus. Lazarus knows it. That's why there's this connection between them. The Pharisees don't know it. The woman at his feet, she knows it. The question is, for us, is how much do we see that interconnectedness? The pandemic and the lockdown has brought a lot of that to our minds. Some of the things that we took for granted before we couldn't get because the health situation made it less reliable. Our sickness recontextualizes other things. That's the way that our body works. When something hurts, the rest of our body sort of shuts down to sort of draw attention to the thing that hurts. You know that when you've stubbed your toe. You didn't realize you had toes before. Now it's the only thing that you can think about. We live in a society now where health has made us focus on those things, has made us focus on health and then realize, wait a second, a whole lot of this economic stuff is connected to health. A whole lot of this public policy stuff is connected to health. A whole lot of law enforcement is connected to health. We see that interconnectedness practically. The challenge also, though, for us is to see the interconnectedness in our response, because our response also demonstrates some of those interconnectedness. We can't respond to health problems without also revealing our spiritual convictions. We can't respond to economic problems without at the same time demonstrating to the people around us what our spiritual convictions are. So we're getting through this. We've seen the light at the end of the tunnel. We're hoping that this is kind of the last gasp of this, and time will tell. But in this story and in many others, our response to this crisis, our response to the crises of anybody else, demonstrate what our convictions are. So this is an opportunity, has been an opportunity for us to reroot ourselves in those convictions and demonstrate them to the world around us. Amen.